Hello, my name is David Adès. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new, somewhat troubled world will see us sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Robbie Coburn, who will be reading poems and talking with me on the theme of healing through poetry. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Robbie is recording from Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung and Bunurong Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land from which Robbie is recording, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Robbie Coburn is an Australian poet and author of the verse novel The Foal in the Wire, which will be published by Hachette Australia in 2025. Called one of Australia's most essential poets by ArtsHub and compared to Sylvia Plath in the Sydney Morning Herald, Robbie's poetry collections include Ghost Poetry, from which he will be reading today, published by Upswell Publishing in 2024, and I Could Not Have Hurt You, Kiddiepunk 2023, and The Other Flesh, UWA Publishing 2019. His poems have been widely published in journals both in Australia and overseas, including Poetry, Meanjin, Ireland, Westerly, and anthologized in books including Writing to the Wire, UWA Publishing 2016, and To End All Wars, Puncher and Wattmann 2018. Robbie has also run poetry workshops for youth mental health organisation Headspace. He currently lives and works in Melbourne. Hi, Robbie, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yes, my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. I wanted to start with a general question before we turn to your theme. What drew you to poetry, Robbie? Or who drew you to poetry?
The first sort of real interaction that I had with poetry outside of, what you might experience, in primary school, there might be some kind of exposure to poetry that you have. But my mother used to read us the verse of Banjo Patterson when we were kids. So that was, I think, what planted the seed for me. But when things really changed for me was when I found the work of Edgar Allan Poe when I was 14. And I read The Raven and something just absolutely changed inside me. And since then, all I've wanted to be is a poet.
Wonderful. I've often thought of poetry as a way of working through things and trying to find some clarity about them. That's certainly sort of one of my processes. So it can be kind of personally therapeutic. But your theme of healing through poetry seems like something more than that. So I want to ask you what you mean by that theme.
So I don't think, I like to make the distinction between, because when people say, is poetry therapeutic? I agree it is. And I think it has always been a lifeline for me, but it's not, it's not therapy per se. It's not, it's not a diary entry. It is a way of processing, but it's an art form that I think creates a space for navigating the world, but it's not therapy in a literal sense. I don't think. It's more that I know for me, poetry has been something that has saved my life many times, and I think it has helped me to navigate some of the things that I've dealt with and the world around me in general. And poetry's essentially the only thing that's ever really made sense in my life. It's the common thread that has run through everything and really kept me going, I think. It's given me a purpose.
And in that way, it's healing?
Definitely. It's hard to articulate exactly how it does that because, as I'm saying, it's not a, therapy in the traditional sense. It's not like, what you purge it out on the page. It's an art form and it's a lot of work,
Yes.
something that I take very seriously as an art form. So I don't want to cheapen it by saying that it's, just this coping mechanism or anything like that. But I think that poetry has just been something that I can always turn to, that has made some of the things that I've experienced. I think when it's resulted in a poem in some way, it's made it all kind of worth it in some way. It's made it make sense that it hadn't before.
Okay. I note from your bio, Robbie, that you have run poetry workshops for the youth mental health organisation Headspace. And that seems to me to be a good place to discuss your theme of healing through poetry. If it is appropriate, can you say something general about those workshops and how they might relate to your theme?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a far clearer thing to kind of articulate in that setting, when you've got, people that, youths that are having, personal crisis, difficulties in their home lives, school lives, mental health struggles, who may have not had an outlet for that. And I think reading poetry like mine has, and speaking to someone like me and hearing what I have to say about poetry and what it's done for me, has sort of created a space for some of these feelings to be expressed that weren't available to them before. And I've had, in the years since, it's quite recently actually, there was a person who was in one of the workshops that I did years ago, and they contacted me, and they're now writing poetry and publishing poetry, and told me that it was as a direct result of the workshop that I ran that they were in. So I think it definitely gives direction, but I think more importantly, it creates a space where people don't feel so afraid to express some of these darker feelings that we don't necessarily discuss openly in most settings. And I think poetry is a space where kind of anything can be explored.
Yeah. I'm thinking particularly of the Australian Mail when you're talking about that, because there is a kind of taboo,
Definitely.
historically anyway. I think it's changing, but a taboo on openness about the dark places. I just wanted to note or ask you whether or not there is any distinction for you between reading poetry as a form of healing as opposed to the process of writing poetry as a means to healing.
I think reading has always been most important. I think they're so connected. I don't think you can write poetry without reading poetry. And poetry's always been a lifeline for me in that way, to read it. But I think writing poetry is a way of navigating and expressing those feelings that you can't necessarily get from reading poetry. You can identify and feel sort of understood and seen by poetry, but there is definitely a difference between writing, and you know yourself that there's no better feeling in the world than finishing a poem that is good, that you're happy with. It's it's the greatest high in the world. You can get a sense of that from reading a good poem, of course, but yeah, I definitely think there's a difference.
Yeah, some poems that I think they're good, and then the next day they're not so good. But
Definitely.
that process. Look, I know we traditionally turn to poetry in times of grief and distress, and in times of celebration. Poetry at funerals and weddings. But do you think poetry really has the capacity to heal? And if so, what is it about poetry that can be healing? You might have answered this a little bit, but I wondered if you had anything more to say about that.
I think it's because, to me, poetry is an art form that can articulate the darkest elements of the human experience that no other art form can. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think there are restrictions, in prose, film, music, whereas poetry seems to have the freedom to really delve into these things in a way that they don't. And I think that's why it does have a healing capacity that other art forms don't. So, for example, in film, you're dictated by a script. In song, you're dictated often by things such as rhyme, verse, chorus, whereas poetry, not that form is not, paramount to the poem's construction, but I think there's a freedom in poetry that you can't achieve with other art forms, and that's what makes it so powerful.
Mm. I want to talk to you a little bit before we start on any poems about this book, Ghost Poetry. It's comprised of almost 60 poems in 3 sections, but in reading and rereading it, which I did a number of times, it spoke to me also as one long poem in many parts, part incantation and perhaps part exorcism. I wanted to know if you conceived of the book as a project before writing anything, or whether you constructed it out of poems you had, and how difficult it was to put it together in the way that you have.
I love that idea of it being one long poem. I hadn't considered that, but I suppose that's always the objective when you're putting a book together, isn't it? That it reads as one cohesive work. So I wrote the title poem and a few of the other poems, such as The Saddle Maker, A Dead Horse, which we're going to read later, and Straw Horses. So they were written in 2021. And then I didn't write again for the better part of a year or two. But then once I started to really explore, I think it came from the title poem to this dreamlike space that the poetry was occupying, nightmarish, dreamlike state. That once I started really writing again, it all happened very organically, and the book was essentially written in a very short space of time, sort of a month or two. And
Wow.
and those initial poems, it was as if I'd started the process of writing this cohesive work years earlier, and then for some reason I just needed a bit of incubating time before I could finish it. But essentially, it was written as one sort of cohesive work, but it was built around those touchstones that I had with those poems that I'd written earlier.
Mm. I was struck by many things in reading and rereading it by the recurrence and interweaving of multiple words. At least, and I went through it and counted at least 7 by my count, used more than 20 times, and one repeated over 50 times. That seemed to be imbued by their repetition with almost talismanic significance. And that made me experience the book, you can quote me on this, as an echo chamber inside a maze of mirrors. I love that line. I found the effect unsettling and haunting. Or to use language from the blurb at the back of the book and from the endorsements at the beginning, the poetry is described as vulnerable, confronting, harrowing, surreal, nightmarish, which you referred to, spectral, visceral, ruinous, apocalyptic, scarified, confessional, consolatory, despairing, defiant. It's a lot of things to pack into a book of poetry. Did you want to make any comment on those observations?
Well, thank you. Firstly, I think essentially the work, a lot of what I write, there's the underlying theme, for want of a better word, of just oppression, and basically all of these things are elements of that experience, and the endurance to still be here, despite it, which is, defiance. I love how you said that it was sort of talismanic. I love the idea, because I do think of it as some kind of ritual. In a way, there is something incredibly spiritual about inhabiting the poem. It's like a conversation with God, for example.
Mm.
Not in a religious sense, but just in this place that we inhabit when we write, that completely removes us from reality, even when we're expressing reality. What was the word that I used 50 times?
Oh, I've got it written down somewhere, but I haven't got it in front of me. But I can let you know later.
No, it's fascinating. I've always noticed that in my work. There are certain words that I use repeatedly, and it's not intentional, but I'm still conscious of the fact that they are words that I reuse often.
I think everyone does it, but I was really struck by it in this book because there were so many of those words, but they were woven around one another. So it was really interesting how, as the book progresses, you keep sort of, words will pop up and you think, oh, I've seen this before, and then you go backwards and forwards and you start sort of making the connections between
Yeah.
the words and the poems. I was also struck by two aspects of the book that sit side by side with one another, and I can't decide whether they are in tension or opposition, or whether each informs the other. So I'm going to ask you. On one side, the book is very grounded in physicality and earthiness, with the constant references to horses, hooves, bodies, blood, bones, flesh, skin, breath, mouths, rain, and so on. And on the other, as you've observed, there are repeated references to what I've called abstractions and uncertainties: ghosts, dreams, nightmares, dark, night, absence, distance, silence, somewhere and nowhere, leaving, returning, not knowing, here, there, and so on. Did you have any particular conscious intention in having these two strands running alongside one another through the book?
No, honestly. I mean, I think, yeah, not a conscious intention when I'm weaving the poems together, but I think it's just something that I do in my practice. In my work is I think my work always inhabits a conscious and subconscious space. So it's always the physicality and the experience, and then the psychological effect of the experience. So if we're talking about something like, obviously, things like self-harm are expressed in the book, but there is the literal act, of self-mutilation, and then there is the psychological impact and the for want of a better word, is the otherworldly space that inhabits as you try and process what that means and what that is, and that also has that sort of ritualistic quality, I think. But it's very much an internal world that is informed by the external world.
Would you say that this book is, in a way, an unburdening?
In a sense, yes, but I still continue to write about similar things sometimes. I think it is definitely that there was an unburdening that came with this book. It was the book that I'd always been trying to write, I think. But I was too young, and I didn't have the life experience, and I needed to work, I think, as a poet and as a person before I was capable of writing it. And I think that's why this book has so many truly raw moments in it, which I just stripped it back, and I didn't try and sugarcoat it, and I just would just give the poems a very literal title that would, essentially just be an assault on the senses. And in that way, yes, I don't think I'll ever write a book like it again. Yeah.
Was it kind of scary putting it out in the world?
Definitely. I've always, I think, because of the writers that I was influenced by, I've always felt that poetry was a space where I didn't hold back. I write about things that I wouldn't speak about with another person, for example, which is a very strange duality that I have with it, in my life. But when it was coming to the point of it being released, I think firstly because it was going to have wider distribution than any book that I'd published before. It was going to be in bookshops and things like that. My previous books, The Other Flesh I didn't launch it. I didn't, send it anywhere for review or anything like that. Whereas with Ghost Poetry, I really tried to do all the things that we're supposed to do to give our work some exposure. So definitely I was thinking, maybe I've exposed myself too much in this book. But then it wouldn't be authentic to myself if I wasn't doing that. And also, no one reads poetry. So
people watch this podcast, and I'm actually going to be asking you about some of the stuff that you don't want to talk about. So
that's fine. I'm more than willing to talk about these things, and that's the other thing. It's it's a blessing and a curse that my life, my personal life, and some of the things that are most difficult about my own experiences and my struggles, they're out there. If I'm to meet somebody and they were to read the book, they're going to know a lot about me and and what I've endured. So, but also it's a good thing because it's who I am, and I'm proud of the work. So I wouldn't take it back or anything like that.
Yeah. And maybe there's some healing in that.
Definitely, I think there's always been sort of a distinction between my real life, so to speak, where you go to work, you have friendships, relationships, and then there's your internal world, which is where you write your poetry and where you're completely vulnerable with yourself. I think there's something quite empowering about being able to remove that distinction in some way by putting the work out there.
Well, we've had this preliminary discussion, but none of our viewers know what we're talking about because we haven't heard any poems. So let's give them a taste, shall we?
So this is the title poem, Ghost Poetry. I will be the ghost who dreams of you until our eyes collide. There is no map in my flesh, no doorways or windows, no spurred heart or bruised throat when we touch. The house where we lived is still standing. Everyone we know is there. I bite into my tongue and say sorry because you have already told them everything. There is nothing you will remember about my new bedroom as you redress yourself in my bones. We sit down on the bed and speak, but you cannot hear me, and I cannot hear you. I want to tell you what happened to me after, what the blood and glass was meant for. Sometimes the night makes you look like a stranger.
So you mentioned this is the title poem. It's the first poem in the book and presumably introduces readers to some of the major themes in the book. This book's had quite a lot of reviews. I had a fun dipping into those. And I'll refer to one, Magdalena Ball in The Compulsive Reader. She says of this poem that it is a rich, powerful meta poem that invites the reader in calling attention to its own poetic construct and setting up the themes of journeys, dreams or nightmares, pain and redemption through judicious spacing and a jagged rhythm. Is that how you see the poem?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, she said it perfectly. I do think it really, it's a perfect sort of prelude to what's coming after that. I think because the poem is more, it's less literal in a lot of ways than some of the poems that follow it. So I think it's a good opening. I think the idea, because I remember Magdalena said that it's quite strange to open a book of poems with the title poem. But I think in Sharon Olds' book, Satan Says, where she opens with the title poem, that was definitely something that I thought was just a perfect way to come in strong. I think to really to begin that experience for the reader.
The poem introduces you, the you, if you like, the other, who appears throughout the book, but seems to me to be enigmatic. As I read the book, I found myself searching for who that you might be, and having a range of thoughts about that. Was it, poetry itself, the muse, self, shadow, ghost? Did you have a specific you in mind for this poem, or was that something you wish to be ambiguous and for your readers to interpret?
It's all of the above, really. But in that particular instance, it is, it's the other in that particular poem. But as it recounts experience through this dreamlike lens. But generally speaking, sometimes the you is myself. Sometimes it's the other. Sometimes it's poetry. yeah, I do like it to be an ambiguous
Mm.
presence in the work.
Mm. And this poem starts, with references to the flesh and the spurred heart, the bruised throat, and so on, and your tongue. The body is prominent in this poem, as it is throughout the book. What role does the body play in this poem and generally in the book?
I think the effect on the body as a physical manifestation of the experience. So if we're referring to something as, for example, the wounding of the flesh, it serves as a physicality brought to the emotional experience. So the body serves also, I think, to place the speaker of the poem in both a physical and a completely dreamlike world as well. So the presence, it's there on the page, the speaker, but the speaker of the poem doesn't exist. So it's there and everywhere, if that makes sense.
So when you're saying there is no map in my flesh, the body is not a kind of map in this book. It's not a palimpsest. It's a bit more abstract than that, even though it's
I think
physical.
It does create a map, but not one that it only exists after the fact. So it's not something that's being followed. It's basically, if we talk about the way the flesh is distinguished by, when it is scarred and altered in some way, that creates a map of understanding of the flesh, but it's not something that was ever followed intentionally, I think is what I mean.
So, I mean, are you saying that the body is a site on which things happen?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, definitely. I think I think the idea of map, evokes purpose of some kind. I think in the sense the book, the body is a map, but the body itself in lived experience isn't, because it endures whatever we put it through.
Mm. There is a craving in this poem for a connection that isn't there, and it's something that is also repeats throughout the book. Can you talk about that and what the barriers are to the desired connection?
I think it's an instance where it's a manifestation of, a lot of different experiences and a lot of different people. I think it's one that does. So you mean as in sort of the barriers of that craving from a physical longing, a longing for a connection that's been lost, and a disconnect between the physical and the dream.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you say, we sit down on the bed and speak, but you cannot hear me and I cannot hear you.
Yeah.
So there is that sort of
Yeah, I think
chasm.
it's something unreachable. I think that it's something that, those sort of experiences come to me in dreams and things like that, where I'll have these experiences and sort of connections with, people from the past, but there's always a disconnect where you can't physically reach out upon waking.
So is the larger sort of underlying theme that we are always alone?
Definitely, in some sense, yes. I think there's a line in one of the poems, anyone in this world will mark you. I think, the just by existing and loving, we do inflict, we are do have suffering inflicted upon us, and I think there's always an aloneness, I think, in the poems, and I think that, the act of writing poetry is such a solitary act, and I think there is always that aloneness when you are someone who writes poetry as well, to bring it back to that idea.
But it's also a bridge, isn't it?
It is a bridge for connection, but not not full understanding of your own experience,
Mm.
because no one will ever know the internal world, I suppose. Not as much as we'd like. We try and understand one another, but not.
I suppose it's a reaching out.
Yes, it definitely is, but it's very hard to identify exactly how and if that is achieved, I think, in a lot of ways with poetry. So I think you can say, for example, reading, The Wasteland by Eliot, and you feel something, you connect, there is a reaching out in the writing of the poem, but I don't feel that we are any closer to understanding exactly what Eliot was wanting to achieve.
No, it's been studied to death. And
Yeah, just to use the most sort of obvious example, but I think that's what I mean. I find it a lot easier to write poems than talk about them. My own work, I mean. I think it's.
that's why we're here, though.
I'm assuming you probably have the same the same kind.
I just talk about other people's poems. I don't talk about mine. Well, okay. Do you want to read another poem? Let's explore these themes a bit more.
Horse Song? Yeah. Horse Song. Every afternoon it happens. I see a horse standing in a paddock in the rain outside my window, not knowing why it is standing there. The bones of animals buried beneath its hooves. One day soon it will happen. It will rain endlessly, and I will not be here.
It's just occurred to me, on one level, this is a poem that's pared back and, in a way, quite simple, and yet it's not. There's a lot more going on in it, and which is what you talk about, the craft of writing a poem. The poem also introduces readers to recurring motifs in the book about horses and rain, and we've talked about the horses representing an earthy animal physicality, but also certain sort of temperamental characteristics, if you like. As I mentioned, there's been a number of reviews of this book, and each reviewer has considered the horse as metaphor and symbol. Here the horse is stoic, patient, enduring. Can you tell us a bit about your history and relationship with horses and what function they have in your poetry in general and in this poem in particular?
So I grew up on a farm, and my father was a horse trainer. So he was a harness racing trainer and driver. So growing up as a child, there were horses everywhere on the property. And this, ever since then, they've been something that I've turned to as a symbol, I think, of comfort and strength throughout my life. And I can't stop writing about them, to be honest. Yeah, and I love horses, how horses appear in literature in general. In Greek myth, for example, my next book that I'm writing, it explores horses in Greek mythology. And for example, in the instance of Horse Song, that's quite as you said, it's quite simple, but at the same time not. It's sort of got this overarching existential theme, and it's a very real memory. Looking out my bedroom window as a child and seeing a horse standing in the rain, because they often don't seek cover when it rains. And I think it's another thing that Magdalena said was that the horse it's the ultimate symbol of power, but it's also they're incredibly flighty, nervous creatures, and I think there's that perfect duality which correlates with humans quite perfectly. But horses, I think, is something that's always going to be a recurring theme in my work. It's understanding where I come from and who I am, and I think myself as a poet and a human being, I think that's just an important aspect of my life and who I am.
Mm. Um, in this poem, the narrator is observer and witness, but anticipating change, anticipating separation, perhaps severance of this relationship between narrator and horse, which will come by virtue of the narrator's departure and absence. The poem states this matter-of-factly without any sentimentality or overt suggestion of loss. As a reader, I'm left to infer things here. The line, "one day soon it will happen," to me could mean it will happen, or it could mean that the narrator keeps telling himself that over and over and yet remains there every afternoon watching the horse. Is it a fair interpretation to read this poem as saying that the narrator wants change but is at the same time stuck and unable to effect it?
Definitely. Very, very well put. There are a few ways to read it, I think, but the way that I intended it is, this idea of ideation. And, as a youth, imagining the space, without me in it. And whether that is, leaving the farm, which I obviously have now. But in that poem, I'm, very directly addressing, mortality and the desire to leave the world.
Mm. As you do throughout the book.
Mm.
Rain, let's talk about rain. It recurs throughout the book and is presented in this poem as endless. I was wondering if this is referring not just to rain as an aspect of weather, but to the narrator's internal landscape.
Definitely. I think the rain in this poem, it's very much loss. I think the the pain that is left when someone is to leave in that way. I think the rain symbolizes the changing landscape of those affected by the loss.
And I wondered if there was a kind of envy in the line about the horse not knowing why it is standing there, that the horse is just content to be and does not require purpose or meaning or any reason to be, just patient, enduring.
Yeah, definitely. And the bones of animals buried beneath its hooves. It doesn't. I mean, we don't exactly know if animals are aware of their own mortality, but I think there's always, when you compare yourself to an animal that's just blissful and content, just eating grass and standing there, when you're in navigating some of these incredibly difficult personal landscapes, there is definitely envy there.
Mm.
That's
Yeah,
something sorry, it's something that I'm exploring more in more recent work, actually. The 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 existence of animals in comparison to the existence of humans.
Mm. The animal, in a sense, is simply being, living in its present and not concerned about past or future.
Mm-hmm.
And not, I mean, we know that animals grieve,
Yes.
so that's clear, but otherwise, perhaps they don't inhabit the past, or the past doesn't inhabit them the way it inhabits us.
There's always been an issue I know that a lot of people experience, and I experience myself, is the idea of never being present in your life because you're always so concerned and caught up on the past and past suffering and how that's going to impact your future. And I'm someone who's lived with mental health issues, addiction, and there is a lot of regret, a lot of pain in the past, and it is sometimes hard to look at yourself and your life and have the desire to move forward because you feel so marked by it.
Mm.
And I think that's something that is in one sense where I really envy an animal. I think is because although they do grieve, they're able to move on and they're not fixated. on the past. And as humans, trauma, suffering, these are things that often we carry forever, or we do carry forever. And sometimes it's hard to move forward from them at all. But I do believe that there is a hope in that as well, though, and we do grow as a result of that. But it's very difficult.
Yeah. Do you want to read another poem?
Blood Ritual. I saved the pieces of you when you fell apart. The deepening puncture of my fingers against paper, writing. I closed my eyes and it was there. A horse I will never see again. Blackened trees fallen in a burning paddock. Knife wounds running with blood viewed through broken glass. Beyond all distance it was there again. Same night, pain, and the right hand rising and gripping the left wrist as if holding the body of a child. I know this time it will be endless. The inconceivable weight of a book bound in flesh.
So this poem is also the title of the first section of the book. So you've put a section of poems gathered around this one. And as we've talked about the book, the poems in this section in particular are visceral, haunting, and anguished. I feel that these poems are trying to confront something that is tormenting the narrator and that can best be approached slant, as Emily Dickinson would say. To the extent that you're willing to do so, can you say something about the genesis of the poems in this section of the book?
I think there's that poem, for example. I think it does cover a lot of things that we've already discussed. I noticed there's the idea of the horse, the paddock, and I think the reason that I titled that section was the idea of confronting these things head on. The book bound in flesh being the result of this kind of exposure of the self in the poetry. And
So you're talking about this book?
Yes, I think all of my work in some sense, but definitely in this book and in that section in particular, that section does focus particularly on self-harm and ideation. I think is the common thread, and trauma. So it was. I think the reason that poem stood out to me is because it covers everything. I think that I'm trying to articulate in that section, and in the work itself.
And the phrase "blood rituals" is dense with meaning.
Yes.
Blood rituals have a long history of sacrifices and offerings to gods.
Mm.
In what way does that history inform this poem and the poems in this section of the book?
To put it bluntly, I know it's quite confronting, but the blood ritual is the act of self-harm through cutting. In my own experience, is what it is. In that instance, I'm aware of blood rituals and their history, and I think that I identify my own experiences as my own personal blood ritual, if that makes sense to say. But I definitely think it's the act, it's the process of that act that, because it does become a ritual, and it does become a repeated cycle that's serving some function for you.
You said that much of this book was written in a fairly short period of time, after a fairly long period of gestation, if you like. So when you came to write this poem and this section of the work, are these poems that spilled out of you in a torrential way in an effort to perhaps exercise them? or are there more poems that you had to wrestle into being?
I don't. It's very strange, but my process always occurs in the former way. It's just once a poem starts, I'll write it very quickly, and it will almost be fully formed, and then I'll edit it a lot before it gets to its final form. But I don't spend great lengths of time working on poems, in the sense of a poem taking days or weeks or months to write. So all of the poems occur that way. But the second half of the book, when I did resume writing, they spilled out very organically. I was in a very particularly bad place when the second half of the book was written, or the majority of the book, and it was a lot of me being awake in the night and writing, but the poems did occur very organically and quite quickly.
I interpret the blood ritual in this poem as having failed in some way. The sacrifice has been made, a horse is dead, knife wounds have run with blood, and yet the torment continues. Whoever the sacrifice has been made to is not appeased. Is this a commentary on the unending struggle for mental health?
Absolutely, and self-harm in particular, achieving something in the short term, but never remedying the problem. That's the same with drinking, drugs, and it is an endless struggle that we find temporary ways of coping with. But yeah, you've articulated it perfectly. That's definitely the struggle with mental health. I've been thinking about that idea a lot lately, because I'm 30 now, and in some senses I'm in the same place I was when I was 15 with mental health. Not on a day-to-day basis. I think in a lot of ways I'm doing a lot better, and I'm a functioning human being most of the time, but unfortunately it is something that is a never-ending thing that we just need to learn to live with. There's never going to be a solution in the sense, in the way that I think that we look for one when we try to find external ways of coping.
Right. You got another poem for us?
A dead horse. There is a paddock I love in particular, but the grass no longer grows. Too long trodden under the weight of horses and resigned only to dirt and depressions in the earth. And the foal my father reared, who died in infancy, buried somewhere there, each eroded furrow like the scar of a tongue crying to be heard. As words betrayed me and rendered me lost once more. Wind revolves like a mare's breath across the pasture in the land I know which you refuse to walk. The burnt earth lined by hoofprints as I walk further from myself to find you. And being unable to touch you now, all we ever knew of one another, like that foal's corpse concealed in the earth.
There are a lot of paddocks in this book, including this one that you love in particular. Are paddocks, among other things, places of solitude and contemplation, places where poems come to you?
Definitely. Particularly when I started writing, that is how most of the poems would come. I would walk the paddocks of the farm, and that is when I would do most of my writing. And I do still think of paddocks in that way. I know they sometimes do appear in dark settings, but when I was growing up and I was seeking some kind of solitude in order to cope, that would be walking the paddocks. And there's a brilliant line by Brendan Ryan, the great poet, where he talks about walking the paddocks and the paddocks cleaning him out. and that's definitely the function that they served for me, and that's that's always what paddocks have been, I think.
Refuge, sanctuary,
Yep, escape.
escape. So what happens now that you're not on the farm?
Nothing good. No, I think we just need to find other spaces, to occupy that will serve that function for us. But I think it's probably something that I need to make more of a conscious effort to return to.
Is it like always going home?
It is. It's harder now because home isn't the farm. The farm had to be sold. So that's the idea of home is difficult because there isn't. My home isn't available to me anymore. Whereas I used to always go back, and it always was. Yeah, finding a piece that's missing, an inner piece that's missing. Living in the city. But my parents are still out. They're still out in the country, so they just don't have the property anymore. So it's not the same. But yes, that's absolutely what it is. It's the idea of returning home to where I belong.
You refer in the poem to each eroded furrow, like the scar of a tongue crying to be heard, which is one of very many fabulous lines in this book. But I feel as if the paddocks in this book are telling their stories, stories of what they reveal and what they hide, grass too long trodden under the weight of horses, the dirt and depressions in the earth, the false corpse concealed in the earth, and that you, or the poet narrator, is listening and hearing them. Do you see this as an example of the poet's craft of seeing and relaying what might otherwise so easily be missed?
Absolutely. And I think I've always viewed the landscape as a metaphor for the body, and the way that it's impacted. And a paddock that's held horses for a long time is very rocky ground. There are furrows everywhere, and you can see. You are witness to the experience and the history of that space. But I think I've always looked at it as metaphor for the body, and poetically from my own body in particular.
So you can read the paddock.
Yes. There's that was an idea in The Other Flesh. I sort of started exploring that idea, and I'd like to get back to it, but definitely. But I think of spaces in general. I'm just fascinated by the history of a space, and what emotions and experiences, private experiences and struggle have existed in those spaces. We often move into houses that have been lived in before, and I've just moved again not too long ago, and that's something that I've really gotten fixated with, and I think that's something that I think it is the poet's job to explore.
Every place has its own story.
Yeah, definitely, and there are so many parallels. The human body and place.
So we've talked a little bit about this. Uncertainty and a pervasive aloneness are also themes in this book. The narrator here, lost once more and walking further from myself and unable to touch you now. This is not just a reaching for connection in these poems, but also a questioning sense of self, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think deciding to pursue the life of a poet is always fraught with those kind of struggles. When the only thing that you want to do with your life is something that generally can't support you financially, and
Yeah.
doesn't really bring you closer to the world in a lot of ways, separates you. That's definitely something that there was always this sort of unknowing of what would become of me out in the world when I wasn't just writing poems on the farm, when I was trying to navigate life, and it's still something that I haven't figured out, and I don't know if I ever will, but that's definitely been, yeah.
It might be every poet, but the sense I got here was that the poems are asking fundamental questions and universal questions. Who am I? Where am I going? What is my destiny? Who will be with me? Because quite often there's no one with you in these poems. And as always with good poetry, there are no answers proffered to these questions in these poems. But I'm interested to know, what are you reaching for in posing these questions?
I think, simply put, understanding for myself, making sense of something that there are no answers to, but there is a way to exist inside poems where it's a lot easier to sit beside those ideas and those questions, I think. But I don't think it's something that's achievable necessarily, when it's these existential questions are not anything that I think you can tangibly find an answer to.
But I suppose in writing and laying out in a poem the irreconcilable, you don't reconcile them, but you sit them in juxtaposition with one another, and there they are. They're made apparent.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot less to fear when you can. It's a lot easier to coexist with them, I think, when they're placed into a poem with you, rather than being something that you haven't confronted.
So is it about a kind of accommodation of all these things?
Definitely. I think they're just, like you said, the great questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And I think there's always the search for answers is something for answers to these questions, even if they don't necessarily exist, always something that recurs in poetry in general. Not just in my poetry, but in a lot of the poetry that I love. And I think it's made coping with these ideas a lot easier, I think, to express them through poetry, rather than just burying them like I think a lot of people do.
Indeed. All right, you got another poem for us?
Yes. Leaving Song. I cannot love you here. Fragments of cinder begin to fall. It is winter, and the night is coming faster. I could not see the air escaping, saying, there is life beyond this room. The notion of longing for this space when it becomes irretrievable, and the emptiness of arriving there. I have thought about leaving again, the knife to my throat in the drive of the day's arrival. Feet crossing the street towards everywhere and nowhere. I have not told you before, your eyes collapsing and never returning. The way I love your body when I am no longer holding it there. And of the earth opening around you, where you are not sleeping, when you are not here.
So we've already talked about a number of the threads in the book that are also in this poem. The body, the idea of leaving, the craving for connection that isn't there. I want to ask you about some other ideas or images in this poem that also recur throughout the book. In Blood Rituals, you read about knife wounds. Here it is the knife to the throat. On my reading, the references throughout the book to knives and blades has multiple aspects: menace, threat, contemplating self-harm, excision, and so on. Can you say something about the role of the knife image in this book?
I think it's all of those things that you've mentioned, but also, the idea of comfort and something to turn to. And I think it's always been such a powerful image to turn to, as both metaphor and, literal experience. I think the idea of doing something irreversible to your own body is a way that it creates a permanence that will follow you after the event. And in a poem such as this, I think when you're exploring the breakdown of a relationship, and then the how I love your body when I'm no longer holding it there, when I'm, the longing for something once it's gone, which I think is just a very normal human reaction to these kind of circumstances. But I think the knife and blades are the idea of these things marking you going forward, which obviously we spoke a bit about before. How, the way that animals live in the present and we don't a lot of the time is, in my own experience, is that there's a permanence that you inflict on the body that in a lot of ways means that you won't be able to easily move on from things, that you're going to be constantly reminded physically about what has happened in your life and what you've done to yourself. And I know that's, these are obviously very heavy things, but I think it's the idea of almost reckoning with that. I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing all the time. It's this idea of learning to exist in a body that you've not loved, throughout your life.
Yeah. Again, as in Blood Rituals, where you read of blackened trees fallen in a burning paddock, here there are fragments of cinder. Images of a fire-ravaged landscape are almost a constant in this book. I've collated some of the words you use to impress this on readers. They include fire, flame, burning, cinders, burning houses, burnt bodies, burnt earth, ash, blackened trees, charcoal grasses, smoking hills, burnt weeds, bonfire, skin burning, and burning rain. Fire and the potential of fire is part of the reality of living in rural Australia, but the way this imagery appears throughout the book is much more than that, isn't it?
Definitely. I think fire serves a similar function to, to the knives, and, the idea of a landscape being completely changed by elements, the same way that, the body can be changed by a blade, but also a cleansing, I think, a new beginning, a way of effectively, completely erasing the past in a lot of ways, so that survival is possible, healing is possible. And I think the fire in the poems in this book, they definitely reference the Black Saturday bushfires that were they happened near quite near where I grew up, and affected quite a lot of people that I knew. And that's definitely something that is where the literal grounding of those images come from. But I think that fire, the same way that it does in in the Bible and in various works of literature, it serves multiple purposes symbolically, I think.
But I don't notice sort of green shoots in this book. What happens after the fire.
There's not a lot of hope, admittedly. But I think that is partly when we were talking about the writing of the book and sequencing the poems. I think I consciously wanted it to feel as realistic as possible to the experience. And at that particular time, I didn't feel that there wasn't sort of much hope for rebirth at that stage. And I think that was definitely a conscious decision that I made, which is why the last poem in the book the book ends with the lines, "You tell me it's too late to walk home and try again." And I think it's this idea of admitting defeat, that your powerlessness beneath, this illness.
And yet, there is a resilience throughout the book too, as some people have commented. But what you're referring to, I suppose, is that sense of desolation.
Definitely. And I think there's only so much that we can endure before you do feel that it's hopeless to try, and to try to get better. When when you're continually finding yourself in these states, despite trying, and looking at ways to find yourself to be well again. I think this book really just explores the idea of the body being ruined beyond repair, at least in the way that I'm thinking of it myself. And it's a common thing with people that have suffered with addiction and self-harm, that you've done irreversible damage to yourself, to your mind, to your life. And the further away that we get from those places of absolute desolation, it's easier to see the possibility of living again and seeing light again. But when you're in those states, it does feel that everything is absolutely ruined beyond repair, and there's no hope of that ever coming back. But if we hold on, it does. And as you said, there is resilience, there is survival. I'm still here. But so that's also a duality, I think. Bearing witness to these things and carrying on. But I think that is what poetry has done for me in a lot of ways, is to get back to the theme of healing. It's that if I'm not here, that next poem won't get written.
Reminds me a bit of the last lines of Samuel Beckett's trilogy. I can't go on, I can't go on, I'll go on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a strange thing. I think when you've decided that there's a way that your life is going to end, and when you've determined that there's this inevitable path that you're going to follow, or map, to reference the title poem, it's very hard to break out of that. It's very hard to wake up and be 30 years old and think, I'm still here. How am I still here? And what do I do now? I didn't intend to be here, but I'm here to write poetry.
Yeah. The next poem is waiting for you, Robbie.
Exactly. But I think everyone, in some way, maybe not in such drastic terms, but I think a lot of people can relate to that. I think it is a purpose that gives us a reason to carry on. You haven't written the best poetry of your life. I haven't written the best poetry of my life. We're always getting better. We're always learning. And I would much rather live a miserable existence to write my masterpiece in old age than to burn out. I think I'd rather fade away to young.
Excuse me. I want to return to the idea of you in this poem. I read this poem as a kind of internal monologue, that the narrator is speaking to someone who is not there. He says, I have not told you before, but he's not telling them now either, because they're not there to hear it. Is that a valid reading of the poem?
Definitely. I think it could be read either way. I think it could be read from the moment that it's addressing, but also that these internal landscapes that we find ourselves in after the fact, and then reassess everything in a lot of ways. And then the mind is very strange, and the heart is strange when we're reassessing our lives and where we end up. I think the journey is just something that's, it's so difficult to ever kind of feel at peace with it, I think, because we do carry these wounds from our experiences constantly. So, but I think that, as I was saying to you earlier, that there are, things that I would say in poetry that I wouldn't say to another person. I think this is a really good example of that. It's something that you might recognize after the fact, and then it's too late, and you'll say it to the poem and not to the person.
Yeah, but you're saying it to the poem and not to the person because you can't say it to the person. The
Yeah.
person's not. I mean, it's always that case. Like you have a conversation and you think, why didn't I say that? But it didn't occur to you
Oh,
at the time, or all those conversations we have in our head, which we've never actually had in reality.
sorry.
Yeah. I also read an ambiguity in this poem. The narrator says, "I've thought about leaving, but it seems whoever the narrator is addressing has already left." So is the leaving song both the song of the already departed and the song of the one contemplating departure? Is there two departures happening here?
Definitely. I think it reverts to the space of leaving the earth physically, I think. Unfortunately, a lot of poems come back to that for me. But I think that one is a far more literal poem in the sense of the departure of the other, of a
Yeah.
person, and then departure. So, the idea of leaving a space where you live and then having to leave physically and go elsewhere. But it definitely, it's steeped in metaphor, definitely.
Mm. There's, I wonder if there's a tension between almost a compulsion to leaving and a fear of leaving.
Definitely. It's one of those great existential questions that come up in poetry.
Mm.
That, of course, there's the desire for an end to suffering, to be released from pain, and then the fear of what will come next, and what happens then. So I think it's the classic idea of, you don't really want to leave, you just want to not feel this way anymore.
Yeah.
Which is very hard to see, when you're in those depths. But there is obviously a great fear. I think everyone who has had that kind of crisis in their lives, and found themselves in those kind of mental states, of course, it's accompanied by fear.
If I think of a poem as a container, if you like, this poem contains a lot, doesn't it?
I really love your readings of my work. I really love the way that you've interpreted them, the poems. But yeah, I do think so. I think and I think that's why that dreamlike space and that surreal space is so appealing to me, because nothing's ever fixed at a certain point. It could be in that container, as you said. It can be the past, present, future, dream,
Mm.
all occurring simultaneously. But yeah, I think there is quite a bit to that one.
Shall we go to another container?
Knife Diary. I woke again and heard the rain. Heavy air dissolving into two mouths, unspeaking. I asked myself if my body was enough to leave behind. Blood on the branches of a pine tree against the darkened window, where I am here alone. making a space for you?
I don't know if in the reading of these poems, viewers are going to get a sense of how mesmerizing the weave of themes throughout these poems is in the book, but I'm certainly feeling it. It's impossible for me reading this book to not think of blood each time the words knife or razor blade appear. There is almost a promise or imminence in this poem that I find terrifying. Is the narrator fighting the two mouths unspeaking by speaking of this, by bringing the impulse into the open so that it becomes somehow less dangerous?
I don't think necessarily. I think it's the feelings that are being expressed of the narrator alone in the poem, while reflecting upon, this separation between the narrator and somebody else. And yeah, it's quite similar to what we were discussing just before, that it's the blood on the branches of a pine tree, and then the idea of, I realize as we're talking how much of this does connect, like how many of these poems weave into each other. I knew they did, but the way that you've expressed it has made me see things that I perhaps hadn't. And when we're talking earlier about the experience of spaces and the things that houses and spaces have endured before we've been there, the idea of me removing my body and creating a space for somebody else. But yeah, it is definitely quite a terrifying concept, I think.
Yeah. And we've talked about, this repeated theme of leaving behind the body, leaving behind life or a place or something undefined, which permeates the book. There is a yearning to escape. And you sort of talked about it as, leaving life. The imperative is always a leaving from, and there is nowhere that I can find any suggestion of a destination, of what it would go towards. That's something that is simply beyond the narrator's contemplation in these poems.
Definitely. I think, although they do inhabit different tenses, and different areas of, of memory, present, future, I don't think there is a destination. I don't think there is a destination in these poems, because it's being written from, not from in the sense of when I was writing them, but it's exploring the anguish of the moment. And that line about asking if I asked myself if my body was enough to leave behind, that also goes back to the idea of poetry and, the body of work. And I haven't been alive long enough to have left anything, truly lasting. So it would just be my body. And yeah, the more we sort of explore these poems, I think that it really does go back to the theme, the idea of through all of the anguish, a desire to stay, to continue to write.
The last two lines, where I am here alone making a space for you, seems to me to be most obviously about the knife in a way, but I wonder whether it is saying something else as well. The act of writing poetry is necessarily something that requires solitude, as we've mentioned, that requires being alone, but it's also reflecting that desire to communicate and connect. So could this poem also be read as making space for your readers for the poems?
Yeah. And I think making a space to preserve the memory of a person and to preserve the memory of an experience. I think there's quite a lot of interpretations of that line. even for myself.
Mm.
So it is, but I do love that idea of it being a space for the reader. In solitude, creating a space for the poem, for the reader to be reading the poem.
Yeah, I mean,
Far more hopeful.
yeah, and I like the idea of every poem should be a place where there's enough space for the reader to wander around in and bring their own,
Yeah.
their own perspectives to it. So it's not prescriptive or definitive. It's left a little bit ambiguous and open so that readers can do that. All right. Got another one?
Dream of human sacrifice. A dream of leaving. The piercing scream of a fired bullet parting dark water. Suddenly I was a child, running a razor blade across my arm, frightened by the blood and mesmerized by the trail it left on the surface of my skin, as if the scar was drawn by an unknown hand and would not follow. Not knowing I would live inside those wounds as if they were shelters welcoming me, saying, you can create a new life and abandon your past. No more nightmares, no more ghosts, no more poems. Just you here alone, always writing the end of a story.
This is one of 8 poems in the book whose titles begin with the words "dream of." What is the role of these poems in the book?
I think when I stumbled upon the concept that I was going to have as a comment, a thread tying the poems in the book together, I realized that, like ghost poetry, the poem, they existed in this space, and in the dream, I was able to remove myself from the poem and write even more openly, I think, about things in a lot of ways. And I think it serves to represent memory as much as dream, I think. The idea of something that you're experiencing internally that that is following you, I think. A haunting, to use an obvious word.
Does the dream operate as a kind of vehicle for detachment?
Definitely. I think there's a few, in a poem like this, the title is obviously very clear in what it's saying as far as, the destruction of the self. And there is a poem in the book that's called Dream of Suicide. And but yes, it does create this detachment where you can really explore things that without feeling that it's quite as confronting for you as the poet.
Well, for me as the reader,
Not the same.
I found it pretty disturbing, both the title and the poem. But I wondered, is the message here that you have the dream and you acknowledge the dream and you write the dream, but you don't succumb to it. You refute it, and you go on, so that the poem then ultimately becomes a poem of resilience.
I think in a way, definitely. And this poem is an example of something that is reflecting on the way that once the body is marked, it's something that you can't escape from, and it's something that's going to follow you. But I think this poem, surprisingly, is quite resilient. It's the idea of you being alone, always writing the end of a story, writing your own death. But the idea of always writing the end of a story means that there is an endurance and there is a will to survive. And I think there is something quite hopeful in that, despite the fact that this poem is, I think, quite disturbing in the way that it is so longingly talking about these acts of self-annihilation. But yeah, no more nightmares, no more ghosts, no more poems. The idea that you can remain here and you will remain here, I think this poem is saying.
Well, I mean, the way I see it, if you're always writing the end, you never actually reach the end.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's this. I think ultimately that is what it's saying. It's that you're always going to be writing the end. You're not going to be following through. It will remain as a dream.
So
That's not the case for all of the poems that begin with dream, but in that one, I think it is. I think it's reflecting on the past, and being a child, being young and enduring these things, and then having the realization that through poetry, through this means of coping, you won't reach the end that way.
in its opening line, the poem begins a dream of leaving, and then towards the end, of abandoning the past, and reflects a desire to let go of the pain that can be unbearable. And this is a motif that recurs throughout the book. The narrator is attracted to no more nightmares, no more ghosts, no more poems, and yet returns again and again to more poems. Is poetry here transformational? Is it an escape from that recurring loop of thought that wants to leave?
Yeah, it's quite a contradiction in a lot of ways, because you're escaping the pain by expressing the pain within the works. But I do think that there is great healing in that idea. But I'm sure it's the same for you. With you couldn't stop writing poetry if you tried. You'd tell yourself that I'm not doing this anymore for whatever reason. It's too painful, or a waste of time, or whatever it might be. But you can't help yourself. It's who we are, and it's something that we're going to constantly return to. And my life doesn't make sense without poetry. I don't feel like I make sense without poetry. Poetry is absolutely everything to me and who I am. And you can't outrun who you are. And I think that's a great acknowledgement of that. But I think there is the idea of this personal experience being so closely tied to the work is a difficult thing to reckon with in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
For example, if I've achieved, a lot of the things that I dreamed of as a poet, it's on the back of, this immense suffering that I've had to endure in order to write the work. Not that it's ever been, intentional or something that I strove to do, but I feel that what I love most is also tortured me the most in a lot of ways.
You've mentioned the last two lines, just you here alone, always writing the end of a story. There's probably a book containing those last two lines. Do you think those lines encapsulate this book?
Yes, and I think my work in general. I think it's the idea of repeating this struggle, but always finding a way through that struggle to endure.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, it's just such a strange thing to kind of wrap your head around when you're the person who's writing it. But I do think that it says, on the blurb of this book, that it quotes Leonard Cohen, poetry being an engine of survival.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely what these lines are alluding to. I think it's that it's, yeah, as you said, if you never you're never reaching the end. You're constantly writing the end.
Yeah.
But you stay.
Now, these poems, in a way, a message to those of us who don't understand the suffering, and saying this is what it's like inside this place. Understand us a bit better.
I think it's not something that I write poetry, for myself. And I think true poetry does need to come from a place where you're writing it because you feel you need to write it.
Mm.
And I think it would come off as incredibly insincere if I was to say, I'm going to write a book that makes people understand mental health or something like that. But I've realized in the last few years, probably the last year more than ever, that how much this work does help people, how important it is to write these things so that people who have experienced it feel understood, and people who haven't can make inroads to understand.
Yeah.
It's something that I feel quite proud of in a lot of ways now, to realize that I've taken things, I think, a lot further than a lot of poets have to express some of these things. And I mean, hopefully for them, they don't need to experience these things. But I think it's important. There are a lot of people suffering, and very few of them will write poetry.
Yeah.
Or read poetry. But for those who do, I'd like to think that it's a lifeline for me, it's healing for me, but I like to think that it could help do some good to help somebody that needs to read it, someone who feels that they haven't seen themselves represented.
And your publisher must have thought it was important to get this book out in the world.
I've been incredibly lucky to have been published by Terry Ann. She published my At the Other Flesh at UWA, but when she started Upswell, it was a no-brainer for me where I wanted to go. She's just always been so incredibly supportive and understanding of and respectful of what I do, and I think she believes in my vision as a poet and what I'm trying to achieve with my work, and it's quite uncompromising, and she doesn't try to ever make me compromise it either.
Mm.
But I feel incredibly fortunate because I know that this work isn't for everyone. I know some people would think it's a bit too dark, or I just know from the reactions that some people have to this kind of work, especially work that's so visceral.
Mm.
It's not an easy read. I know that, but I'm so grateful that Terry Ann has been so supportive, and very grateful that it did get reviewed, and I've had some really positive reviews, and I'm very proud of the book. I'm very proud of the book and what I've been able to achieve as a poet in terms of writing poems that resemble what I envision my poems to, what I would like them to be. I mean, I don't think we're always trying to do better, aren't we? But I think this is the closest thing to what I've always aspired to write.
Mm. Do you have another poem for us?
Straw horses. And again the rigid dawn, again the morning, at the point of waking, where the impenetrable hours revolve and rebuild you, dressed in old skin. These bodies are strangers, disappearing into separate fields, like straw horses in a thunderstorm. The paddock will end, no matter how slowly we walk, no matter how my mouth is wounded each time I kiss you, no matter the ache of our soaking bodies and heaving throats, when I say love will drown you. To the shivering bones, to the town within your flesh I enter, to the backyards where water pools in the broken earth's basin. I can call you and use your name as refuge, your arms as a farmhouse, becoming a bonfire at the edge of knowing, where I could invent you again and relearn the violence of your mouth, like the pounding of horses' hooves trampling us because they do not know we are lying there in the paddock. Take my spine as a rein, make my blood a trail for you to ride. Look back and forget the pulse of the fence lines closing in, our skin burning when we touch the dark rain. When I watch desire drive your scarred body free. When you can, forgive the unchanging dawn. Forgive the burning rain. Forgive the horses colliding with your childlike flesh, puncturing your drowning lungs. Forgive me.
You say something, Robbie, about violence and desire in this poem and in the book generally.
I think it's that recurring idea of being wounded by those we love, and the impact that people have on our lives. I think violence is there's the violence towards the self is always the physical violence in the work, but I think it's the idea of being harmed by others is also a recurring theme. I think it's just a thing that I'm fascinated by when I'm constructing my poems. I always find these images recurring. It's not something I set out to do. In fact, I consciously try not to. A lot of the time I'll think, I can't be referencing flesh again. But I think it's just it's a physical embodiment of what I feel emotionally and the impact that others have had on me, and the way that marks the body and follows you. And I think the idea of reconnecting, trying to love again, trying to trust humans in general, relearn to believe that there is good in people. I think after you've experienced trauma is a lot of what that violence is referring to.
If you've been so harmed by people who you've loved or who have loved you, does that manifest itself in a paralysis on your part because of a fear that you might harm as well?
Yeah, I don't think I've been, mistreated any more than, I think as humans, we do have a profound impact on each other, and we, by existing, we do harm people, we do hurt people's feelings, and those experiences inform how we view the world going forward. But no, I'm a poet, so I don't think I'll ever be too far away from romanticism and the belief.
Good to hear.
And I'm very lucky. I've been very lucky in my life, and I feel that it probably seems a lot more black and white. I'm not really referring to trauma from a significant other. I'm sort of thinking, a deeper trauma that's ingrained from the past that impacts how we see the world. But I think it's our relationships in general. I think being a human, we all experience great negatives and great positives in our interactions with people in general. But it's not referring necessarily to romantic heartbreak or anything like that. Although of course these things do recur in poetry all the time. But yeah, I think it's just the way that the body is marked generally, and how experience shapes us and how we view the world going forward.
Do you mean the title of this poem, in the defined meaning of the term straw horse, as any weak argument or proposal that won't hold up to intense scrutiny?
No.
No.
No, more a fragile object,
Mm.
easily destroyed and blown away.
Mm. What is behind the very strong need for forgiveness in this poem?
It's forgiving myself for the past, I think. It's to not to repeat, what I've said earlier, but just I've made quite a mess of my life at various points. I've made it very hard for myself to be able to function as a normal person, whether that's through, marking my body, the pain, but essentially I think it really goes back to the pain that I've inflicted on the people that are important to me because of my own struggles. How these struggles have impacted my family, for example. How by harming myself, because these are never about being forgiven for something that I've done to harm someone else. It's always what I've done to myself and how that's impacted the people that care about me.
Mm.
And forgiveness it's a big part of recovery, of course, is the idea of forgiveness and being able to forgive yourself, and move forward. But that's something I still struggle with. I have real issues with self-esteem, and the belief that I matter in the world, and that I matter to people. But I'm very lucky that I have beautiful people in my life. But I think it's a forgiveness of self that I'm searching for.
Mm.
It's almost in a it's almost in this overarching spiritual kind of way. It's not with a religious aspect to it at all, but the idea that I can look in the mirror, reflect on my life, and not say I've made such a mess of myself that there's no hope for me, and the idea that I can forgive myself and believe that I do deserve to be here. I do deserve to know happiness and joy in the world. And I think that's just something that I'm constantly going to have to wrestle with, I think. But it's I think it's quite an optimistic idea, though, that I believe that forgiveness is possible, and I can forgive myself.
I think forgiveness is necessary.
I don't think there's a way forward without it.
Mm.
If you're constantly just hating yourself, you're well. I can tell you from experience, it's not very productive. It's not very beneficial for anything.
No, well, you can't love someone else until you love yourself, really. So,
Yeah, I definitely there's an element of that, but I think it's we're always growing, and I'm definitely a lot better at it now. I'm a lot more at peace with who I am, and I understand I needed to get to that place to go. I needed to be in that place to get to this one, the same way that I needed to write all those embarrassing poems that I wrote when I was starting out in order to write these ones that I'm proud of. So it always comes back to poetry, and
yeah.
if I didn't if I hadn't gone through the things that I'd gone through, I wouldn't have written ghost poetry. That's how I look at it.
Um, I want to revisit your theme of healing through poetry through the lens of this poem, um, where you're, concerned with forgiveness. What does this poem have to say about healing through poetry, do you think?
I think in a lot of ways it's almost a declaration to the idea that that forgiveness is possible. Watch desire drive your scarred body free. I think is saying that there is always the possibility of forgiveness if you're willing to accept it and to look and to believe that you are deserving of it.
Mm.
Um, but simply put, in terms of the theme, I think that I don't think I would be here without poetry. Well, I know I wouldn't. It's been sort of a constant reason to stay, and yeah, to say it again, it's just there's always another poem that needs to be written, and you can't do that if you're not here. And I think this poem is really reflecting on that. Um, yeah, it's a difficult thing to describe without sort of getting into quite corny territory when people talk about something art saving them in that way. I think it can sometimes sound like it's not a realistic portrayal of the experience, but I definitely think I don't know what your own experience is with healing through poetry, but for me, it's it's the reason that I'm here.
Mm.
I know that it always will be.
Okay. You got another poem for us?
Love song. And the empty streets filling with rain, a presenceless form passing beneath nameless buildings. Everything has a place set for us, unknown to you and known before I can speak your name. In the unbearable dawn where I cannot touch you. How often I have lived here alone, somewhere, a transfiguring voice telling me the names for our lives and the meanings for the names. It feels like you could be born again and remember waking for the first time. I cradled your body in a dream.
If I were to look at a poem's title, this one called Love Song, I would not have imagined this poem with its empty streets and its nameless buildings and its unbearable dawn. Is it a love song because it contains a seed of hope in the prospect of transfiguration and rebirth?
Absolutely. It's one of my poems, so that's probably why it's not like reading, Keats or something, but it's I definitely think there is great hope in it, and there's the idea of rebirth through love for another person, feeling as if they can sort of save you in some way. And but you're right, it is kind of far darker than the title would suggest.
Is every waking like waking for the first time with all its potential and possibilities?
Absolutely. I think it's to view your life in a completely different way and feel that you can start again, that you do want to be here, and there are reasons to be here, and turn your back on the things that you're holding on to that are not allowing you to move forward.
The poem opens the third section of your book. Are you trying to signal anything by opening the section with this poem?
I think the poems in that section definitely reflect differently upon the idea of romantic love, and but I think I wanted the duality of love in between humans, and then love for what you're used to. So there's a poem called "Love Poem to a Razor Blade," for example,
Mm. Mm.
and I think the idea that you can be you do have a relationship, with your addictions and with your own suffering, unfortunately. And I think that was definitely something that I wanted to explore side by side. So definitely, I think I was trying to signal something with it, but I don't think it might be deceptive that it looks like it's going to open to a lot more light than the other sections, when it obviously doesn't at all. But yeah, I think it explores a lot of the same themes as the other sections, but I think it more directly references the relationship and connection that you have to both people and to our addictions, and in this instance, self-harm.
Mm. What is the significance for you of the transfiguring voice telling me the names for our lives and the meanings for the names?
The future, the idea of something that a future that's available to you that you didn't think was possible. So telling you that this is your life and it can change. It can change and become something else. So yeah, I don't know how much more I can really say about it, but it is this idea that perhaps I don't need to go down the path that I thought I did, and I can live, I can endure, and our lives will be better.
You can assert some control over it?
Definitely. And I think there's a gratitude as well in still being here to experience it.
Mm. There are many references to dreams in these poems. Do these poems contemplate dreams as refuge, sanctuary, relief from the torments of consciousness, or do they regard dreams in other ways?
I think in this book, definitely, it's on the contrary. A lot of I've always had a strange relationship to dreams. I've always had very vivid nightmares, but also there is definitely refuge in sleep, and a lot of the time the sleep in these poems is sort of alcohol-induced sleep, and I think that the dreams serve a lot of functions where it becomes very difficult to distinguish reality from dream.
Mm.
And that's both true of the work and I think how dreams can impact us in general in our lives. I think that sometimes you'll have a dream that you wake up and it takes you some time to realize that it wasn't something that actually occurred. I think the poems in this book just blur that line where the waking world and the sleeping world are essentially completely running alongside each other at all times.
Mm. I know as you get older, there are times when you have a memory and then you can't actually remember whether that's remembering a dream or a real thing. So that it does get blurred because memory plays tricks on you.
Well, I think that's just, when they talk about people who write memoir, for example, and they say that no one can completely remember everything accurately that happened. And I think dreams are much like memory. I don't think that I don't think there is that distinction, but yeah, as you say, when you can't remember if something was a dream or something that happened in your past, or I'm not sure what the difference is for me at this point in this book, because they just seem to be always coexisting, I think, and both of them have a very significant impact.
I imagine that in writing this book, you had to completely immerse yourself in an almost obsessive way into its subject matter and themes, even though they came out in a torrential way. Do you think your poetry will move in other directions now, or you're likely to explore these ideas further?
Yeah, I always am, I think, immersed in particular concerns in writing. I think we all are as poets and writers, but yeah, I very consciously am trying to move away from such. I feel like writing this book really allowed me to kind of exercise in some way what I've been trying to express in my poems since I started writing. And my new work definitely is broadening its sort of its lens in the way that it's approaching some of these subjects. The same kind of themes definitely do appear in the work. I think they always will in some way, but I honestly just think my work's maturing a lot as well, as I mature as a poet and a person. But yes, I do think my work's going to go in different directions. I'm writing less directly about the self.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about this book?
I just that I'm just immensely grateful to everybody that's supported the work, and I think we've got to remember, once upon a time, both of us were just sitting there thinking, you dream of writing a book and publishing a book of poems, and you just need to take a step back sometimes and realize that you've done it, and then you end up on Poets Corner talking to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
I'm very for you having me here. It's been great to talk to you.
It's been wonderful to talk to you, and for sharing your poems and exploring, quite deeply your experiences, thoughts and insights on the theme of healing through poetry, although that was just a touchstone for a lot of other things we talked about. Details of Robbie's books and where to get them will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. Next up on Poets Corner, I'm not sure who we have, because we're supposed to have Mark Kiddiepunk reading poems and talking on the theme of the 6 gifts, but I'm not sure when that's happening. And we also have Natalie Damjanovic Napoleon talking about erasure poetry.